It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Dr. Pessy Krausz. Your maiden name was Markovich, and you were from Leipzig in Germany.
Yes.
So Pessy, if you could just mention a bit about your family and your history.
Right, okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to describe something of my family history, because most of my family was lost. And as I was born in Leipzig, it was so happened that the reason was that my father, who had been actually from Poland, and this is actually a photograph of my father in the happy days when he was with his parents, with his two sisters, and his on this are two little children, his sisters Chava and Zelda, and the two little children Nuta and Zusha did not survive. Now this is similarly a photograph of my father's parents. I'm called Pessy after my father's mother. She died of an illness at the age of 42, but his father, my grandfather, Avraham Markovich, and two little children, two of his grandchildren, did not survive the death march to Auschwitz, and they perished of starvation. Now, my father left Poland when he was just before 17, because then in Poland he would have been conscripted into the Polish army and would have remained there for about, I think, 30 years or something. So he and quite a number of his contemporaries went to Leipzig in Germany, where they learned the fur trade. So my father learned how to be an expert in knowing which were good skins. And I actually do have a photo of my father here at the bottom here. I don't know if you can see this. He is here, he is standing here, and he is behind somebody who is examining furs. This was in London when we finally managed to reach London. And here he is at the fur auction. So he actually was quite successful, Baruch Hashem. So that's how my father came to be in Leipzig. Now my mother, on the other hand, she was born in Dresden. So that was a very cultured city. Her parents, those are my maternal grandparents, Beryl and Malka Langerman. They had like a menswear shop, and this is actually a photo of my grandmother. This is my mother's mother, Malka Langerman. She was actually, maiden name was Krakenstein. And so my mother's mother, she ran the shop. So she ran this great store in Dresden, while my grandfather, Beryl Langerman, would be upstairs and actually was known by Dr. Josef Burg, who people in Israel may remember was the foreign minister and travelled from town to town all over the world. And he knew, and he would stay with my maternal grandparents. And his sister was a great friend of my mother's, and he was a friend of my mother's. And when I used to meet Dr. Burg on King George Street, he would say to me, "Ach, du bist eine geborene Markovic, eine Langermann, und ich weiß genau, 42 Kleine Bruderstraße." He knew my address, and he would start singing my grandfather's Zmirot. Yoim Zemechibot, you know. He knew him, and it was an amazing life. And my mother had the most gorgeous voice, and she studied in the conservatoire in Dresden music and opera. And she knew whole operas by heart. She would play the piano and sing these operas. But of course, as a religious person, coming from a religious family, she could not be in opera. So in the afternoons, she used to help in her mother's store. And when the war started to break out in about 1930, it was about 1935 already. So across the road there was a cousin called Lippe Ehrlich, and he was a bachelor, and he had a very small menswear shop. And when the Nazis began to break in and loot the shops of the Jews, so it was very easy to break in to Lippe Ehrlich's little shop. But my grandmother's big 3-floor apartment building with a big store was all full of bars at night, so they couldn't get through. But she heard when they broke in to his little shop, and when they'd left, she would smuggle goods in so that Lippe Ehrlich would have something to sell, so he would have a parnassa. My grandmother was also the head of the Gemach in Dresden, and she would make sure no bride or groom went under the chuppah without a dowry. She would collect for people. People would know that this was Malka Langerman would look after you. Now what happened was that my mother had a younger sister, Fanny, who was rather delicate. And the Nazis deported my mother's sister at the same time as they deported Lippe Ehrlich. And my mother told me that Lippe Ehrlich somehow through the Red Cross would send letters to my grandparents saying in German, "Sorge dich nicht, don't worry. I'm looking after Fanny." Of course, both of them perished, and so did my grandparents. The last time that my mother saw her father, and I do have pictures of them somewhere. I'll just stop it for a minute. Right now, so these were my mother's parents. This, as I showed you on the larger photograph, was Malka Langerman, Nie Krattenstein, and this was Dov Beryl Langerman. And he was the sweetest person, according to what my mother told me. Now, one of the problems growing up was that everything was very painful for my parents, as I'll explain later how we fled. And so I didn't ask very much, but she told me this was my mother when she was a young girl in Dresden, and this was her brother, who was the Leo Langerman. He was the youngest attorney general in Berlin as a lawyer ever. At 33, he was 28, he was the attorney general, but at 33 he had to flee because of the numerous clauses. And this was my father as a young man, and his brother Joseph, his older brother Joseph, and younger brother Pesachia, Paul. And my father managed to flee to London. His older brother Joseph managed to flee also through miracles, finally to America, and the younger brother, who also managed to flee through miracles, to Paris. and they were all in the fur trade together. Now, and here you have the grandfather who I mentioned to you, my father's father, Avraham Markovich, and my late brother was called after him, and my grandmother, Pessy, who I'm called after. Now, my mother's father and mother were on a bus with my parents and apparently me, and they were travelling across the border, and my grandparents didn't have the correct papers. They had Startlos papers, and my parents had German papers, and my parents were not thrown off the bus, but they, elderly, were thrown off the bus. And my mother said the last time she ever saw her father, he was running after the bus, and he'd forgotten his tefillin on the bus, and he was saying, "My tefillin, my tefillin." So from now on, whenever I see anybody with tefillin, I try to give gifts of tefillin to my children, my grandchildren, everybody, in memory of my beautiful grandfather. So now, how did we leave Leipzig, where I was born? It's quite an amazing story. It goes back in phases, and it starts actually in Leipzig in 1938, when I was a little baby of not quite a year, that the stormtroopers came knocking on the doors, and alle Juden raus on Kristallnacht, that's about November the 4th, 5th, something like that, and the sound of the broken glass, as we all know. And they knocked on the door of the house that we were, and they knew exactly where every family was. And so my mother put me in her arms, and together with my father ran upstairs to non-Jewish neighbours, and they said, "Please, will you hide us?" And the non-Jewish neighbour says, "Impossible, because if we hide you and this baby makes a noise and we're found, our lives also will be worth nothing." But my mother, very persuasive, said, "This baby will not cry, I promise you, hide us." And so they pushed us apparently into a clothes wardrobe in the back of a bedroom and closed the door. And when the stormtroopers knocked on our door, we weren't there, they ran up to the non-Jewish neighbours. Unfortunately, I do not know their name. They are real righteous Gentiles. Because when they knocked on their door, the German stormtroopers, Nazis, said, "Wo sind die Markoviches? Where's the Markovich family?" And they said, "Oh, the Markoviches." This is how my mother told me. Schon lange fort, long ago they left. And apparently these Nazis looked around. They weren't sure, should they believe or not. But these non-Jewish neighbours were so convincing and casual and relaxed that they just closed the door and left. Now, the next day, they were murdering the Jews in Leipzig. In the streets were full of blood as well as glass. And so my father, who was very resourceful, found like a farmer who was travelling from town to town with hay, with a horse and cart. And so he said to this man, "I'll pay you, will you take my wife and my baby to Antwerp?" And the man said, "Well, if you'll pay me." And he spoke Flemish. So my mother had to learn in Flemish. She put a little scarf round her head, and she had to learn, "Ich bin die Frau von dieser Mann, I'm the wife of this man, and we're going to Tante besuchen. We're going to visit my auntie mit das Kind, with a baby and all that." So she learnt all this, but fortunately, they weren't challenged. My father somehow got to Antwerp, and he was there when this horse and cart with my mother and me rolled up. And there we were in Antwerp in 1938. And my father, you say that the Jewish people are a stiff-necked people, maybe as a people, but as an individual, my father was even more stiff-necked than any people. And my mother said, Aaron, don't start the business again. He wouldn't listen. Again, he put up beautiful Gobelin tapestries and lovely silver and lovely things. And in 1940, my mother told me, they suddenly saw through the windows that there were carts driving through, rolling through with cars and with Jews piled one on top of the other out of Antwerp. So what to do? Antwerp is a port, but the last ship had left. They missed the boat, that boat. So my mother said, and by the way, I still don't know to this day how it was my mother spoke German, French, English, Yiddish. I never asked her. As a child, you just don't always know how to ask. So my mother said to my father, what are we going to do? He said, we have to go, we have to run. So the very next morning, my father put me on his shoulders. I was wearing a little siren suit. It's called a siren suit. It's like a baby all-in-one with leggings and a thing and a zip. And my father was wearing the same. In those days, men wore those. Churchill actually was seen wearing them in the war. My mother, smartly dressed, by his side, she saw him looking around at the beautiful wall hangings, and she told me, let him look, it'll be the last time he'll ever see them. And it was the last time he ever saw them. On his shoulders, off we went. He had a grey felt hat like a trilby, and I remember nodding along on top of that trilby, and my mother closed the door and started running. And I remember boom, 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 bombs dropping all over. And my mother told me, this is how my mother explained it. She said, people said to her, where are you going? Where are you running? People were running all over. She said, to Dunkirk. They said, Dunkirk? The port of feu. It's on fire. My mother said, where there is water, there is hope. And how we managed to run to Dunkirk from Antwerp, I will never know. On the way, I don't know what we ate, what we drank, nothing. But on the way, there was like a huge hangar where probably aircraft, like sort of little helicopters might be normally, an aircraft hangar. And loads of people were all resting, and we rested there as well. Exhausted. Then all of a sudden my father stood up and put me on his shoulders, and he's 6'2", and when he stood up, everybody in that hangar stood up, and then he went to the other side, and there was a sort of a little lake. He leapt over the lake, everybody waded through the lake, and when they all got to the other side, there was a direct hit on that hangar. So anyway, on his shoulders, me nodding, my poor mother saying, I can hear her today saying, Nicht so schnell, Aaron, das Kind schläft, don't go so fast, the child is sleeping. And I knew it's because she couldn't keep up with him. And he's saying to her, Komm Ginchu. Her name was Regina, and Gina for short, and Ginchu was his pet name for her. So he said, Komm Ginchu. And I sort of can feel how he pulled her on, schlepped her along, and finally we reached the shores of Dunkirk. And we collapsed into a sort of a bunker. Now what to do? Well, my mother and father saw a British officer. The British were evacuating the troops. The troops were falling like flies with the German bombers coming overhead. And there we were, and my mother saw British officers walking in front of this bunker where we were. So she and my father put me on his shoulders and she said, "Come on, we're going to speak to him." And fortunately she spoke English. So she said to the officer, "Will you take us?" "No, madam, we are evacuating the British troops." Off he went. Back into the bunker we went. And then another officer passed by. My father, in his best Yiddish, said, "Free game, ask this one." So out we got, and there he stood, this officer in his smart uniform with his belt and everything. If you see the film of Dunkirk, I saw only a trailer because I couldn't take it, but you do see how they looked. So my mother said, "Will you take us on a boat?" "No, impossible." So she pulled the gun from his holster and held it to my head on my father's shoulders. And she said, "If you do not take us, I shoot my child, my husband, and myself before your eyes." And the poor officer, very trembling, took the gun, put it in his holster, and he said something like, "Come along, madam, come along." And I remember being pushed over the edge of a wide wooden sort of like, well, it must have been, what was the edge of the boat? Boom, deep down into a corridor there. And in we were with the British troops. And I remember to this day dancing up and down this little corridor, troops piled high and being patted on the head, and I'm singing my little German song, Pessy Krausz, mach hop, sa, 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 and I'm so happily singing away. I don't know. Anyhow, that's how the other miracle happened, that we were actually shipped to, I think it was Dover, and there the police were around taking in the troops, telling the troops where to go, and then they see us. "What are you doing?" "Well, we just escaped." Of course, my father doesn't speak any English. He speaks kind of a Polish German, and he immediately suspected as an enemy alien. They think we're spies. So my father's put into jail, Holloway jail, where a whole load of convicts were without papers, and my mother and I were put on the Isle of Man, where a lot of refugees, enemy aliens, were. And there we stayed for almost a year until somebody could vouch for my father.
Pessy, this is just unbelievable. Can I just ask, how old were you when this all happened?
I got to England at the age of 2.5.
And you still remember being thrown on the other side of the boat?
Yes.
And you remember the bombs coming down and being on top of your
I didn't know there were bombs. I knew there was a bomb.
And that is very clear in your
recollection. To this day, if suddenly a door bangs, I jump. It's involuntary. And it probably, later on in my profession as a psychotherapist and so on, I recognise that it's probably untreated trauma or something like that.
I want to mention something. It's no coincidence that today is the 26th of May, and it's 70 years to this very day that this was in Dunkirk, when the British, when they decided that they had to leave Dunkirk and
evacuate.
This was the evacuation.
Is that so?
It's the anniversary of the evacuation.
Is that right?
From the 26th of May to the 4th of June. And it happened today.
I can't.
70 years ago.
That is incredible.
It's to this very day.
That is unbelievable.
And that
There's
we
no
would
such
be
thing
telling the
as
story
coincidence.
70 years later.
No such thing as coincidence.
It's actually quite amazing.
Yes.
But that evacuation of Dunkirk was a monumental event.
Absolutely. It really was.
And to think that your parents fled with you from Antwerp. This is in the north of France, Dunkirk. I mean, the distance is immense.
It is amazing. I don't know how they did it.
The courage that your mother and the foresight that she thought that...
I think it's a question of do or die, you know. I mean, if we would have just perished on the shores if it just was desperation. My mother was a very resourceful person. So when we were finally released from the Isle of Man, the next phase was also not so easy. Would you like to hear?
Absolutely. Can I just ask you before we go into that phase?
Yes.
Were there any other civilians that you know, any other refugees that also were evacuated?
Well, when I was at college, I had a friend whose father was a historian, and he looked into it, and there were no other civilians that he could find anywhere that were evacuated with the British troops at Dunkirk.
It's a miracle.
Nowhere.
It's a
It
miracle.
was just a miracle. And my mother used to tell the story to my children. So, I mean, they heard it with the whole, everything, you know, the whole, every incident. So it's like, when I tell it today, I mean, I feel it and I relive it. But I remember my mother telling it. And so it's like Lador, who tell me stories. And whenever one of our children has a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah, and I'm asked to say a few words sometimes, so I always mention the miracle that actually the British did take us in, even though we were in jail, but eventually we were allowed to stay, because there was no country of our own. There was no Medinat Yisrael. We had nowhere to go. And today, our children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, Baruch Hashem, all in our precious Medinat Israel. And we can't take it for granted. That's why all of them try their best. They volunteer, they do all kinds of things. And I think that the awareness of the miracle of that we have our own country is important to pass on. That this can't be taken for granted.
Absolutely.
And it's only 72 years old, and look what we've done in 72 years. It's a miracle in our time. We're living it. We're living in Jerusalem. Even poor Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't get here. And here we are. So we can't take it for granted. And I never have done. And as I think I mentioned to you before, but when the State of Israel was declared, so I was about 10, and I didn't know anything about anything. I went on Shabbat morning, there was a children's service, and from the children's service, attached to the shul, we would go into the general service. This particular Shabbat morning, Mr. Brody, who was the head of the headmaster of the Cheder and took the children's service, we were all sitting there, and he said, "Children, stand up." Of course, we stood up. Not like today, stand up, come on. Stand up. Today, a miracle has occurred. What's that? Today, we have a country of our own. We're going to sing the Hatikva. We all sang the Hatikva, and we sang another song. Anyway, we sang these two songs. I thought, I can't understand. We have a country of our own. We have Israel. So I ran afterwards to my parents. I said, "What is this, a country of our own? Isn't this our country?" "No, we now have a country for the Jewish people." So I said, "Okay, so when are we going?" They said, "Look, this is really a fact." They said it took us a long, long time to establish us here. It's very hard. We had a hard time with the language, with the culture, everything in England. We can't uproot ourselves, a new country, a new language, and everything. But I decided from that moment on, I'm going to my country, at that moment. So then, when I was at college, when I was studying, I mean, this is about me a little bit now, but nevertheless, I decided that I'm going to study subjects which, when I get here to Eretz Israel, will be useful. And so I started studying social work, then I did management training, then I did psychotherapy. And when I got here, I worked for the Ministry of Social Welfare right away, because my late husband, Neville, had the foresight. We have 3 gorgeous sons, and he also, when we met, the first thing was, he asked, do you want to go to Israel? Yes. I want to go to Israel. Yes, that's the first thing. Right. So when our children were about 7, 8, 9, 10 and so on, he used to arrange for a qualified Hebrew teacher, Israeli teacher. She came to live with us, not as an au pair, as a teacher. I was the au pair, and she was like a bat bayit, and she taught the children the whole curriculum that would be used in Israel, Machsheva Israel, all the subjects. And I, by osmosis, they didn't speak a word of English when they arrived, I managed to absorb Hebrew. So when I got here, apart from anything, Neville used to teach Hebrew in the Zionist Society, which he was the head of in Sheffield, the north of England. I spoke Ivrit. So there I was landed somehow right away in the Ministry of Social Welfare. So I've been useful. And there I did a doctorate in I was working with children and so on, child development and management stress. And that has been very useful. I did management training. So I've been useful here in Israel in my time.
Pessy, I want to ask you, just going back 80 years ago, did you ever ask, I know it's hard for you to remember, but did you ever ask your father what made him stand up and leave that, where they were all sheltered? And
well, we all 3, oh, you mean in that hangar?
In that hangar, because
he said he just had a feeling. He just had a feeling. My father, must tell you, he came from a traditional religious home in Poland, but he wasn't as spiritually devout as he was when we finally got to England, because he said through all these miracles our lives have been saved. My mother, because she lost her parents in the way that she did, and he also his father, but she felt that it was very hard for her. She remained religious till the end, and very hard for her to retain that inner emunah. So I never really asked him.
But it's amazing that he decided to stand up, and by doing that, he saved his own family, saved you,
yes,
and he saved all the people in that hangar.
Yes.
And it took a direct hit.
A direct
hit. If he wouldn't have stood up and left that hangar,
yeah, that would have been the end.
It's just, what a miracle.
It is a miracle. We went through a number of miracles.
And if you think this only happened 80 years ago, it's not a long time ago.
It's not a long time ago.
When you saw your father, when he was he was confined in a so-called prison, and you were with your mother
on the Isle of Man.
Did you have any contact with your father?
I don't know. I mean, I was a little kid of 2. I think I was about 2.5, and I don't know. I didn't know where he was. And
did your mother know? Did she?
I don't know. I never asked her. All I know is that there was wire netting like this all around this camp, and I'm struggling to get out, and nothing to do all that time. And my poor mother, I used to say in German, because I only spoke German then, "Erzähl mir eine Geschichte. Tell me a story." And my poor mother, she had to tell me one story after another. She was a wonderful storyteller, now I come to think of it.
Do you remember seeing your father being reunited?
Then I remember. Now, to be reunited was the most amazing thing. Suddenly, and I don't know how, I see this man, and then my mother and me. And we landed up in a place called Bletchley, Buckinghamshire. I have no idea why. And to this day, I remember knocking on doors. "Have you got a room?" "No Jews here."
Wow.
Knocking on the next door. "What? Have you got a room?" "No Jews here." Boom! Eventually, I didn't speak any English. I said to my mother, "Mummy, was ist das no Jews?" He said, put his hand over my mouth. Psst, quiet. No Jews here. Then we knocked on a door, and this angel with an apron, I remember seeing her, with like a sort of a greyish hair. "Have you got a room? There's an attic if you want." Yes. Up we went 3 flights of narrow stairs into a palace, a little room with a little sink, a little gas cooker, a bed, and a little cot thing for me. And that was where we found our feet when we first got out of jail. And into how it happened, I never asked. I never asked why we went to Buck. It's terrible because now, of course, people speak, and one of the reasons that I do like to explain things and so on is because I never had the wherewithal to ask anything. I just had to take everything for granted and be happy with what Anyhow, that first, somehow or other, my father took the train from Bletchley to London, where the fur trade centre was, and there he found a lot of his chevra, also refugees who'd fled, and there he started working. And the first money, I remember distinctly him saying to my mother, "Ginchu," and it was in German, "here is money, go and buy candlesticks." And I remember going with my mother, trotting along, and we bought candlesticks. And the next week he came home and he said, "Here's some money, go and buy a becher to make Kiddush." And I remember going with my mother to buy a becher. And she said to them, "Have you got a dish for the becher?" "Yes." And the dish was like round, but it had sort of indentations. She said, "I don't like the indentations." They said, "Don't worry, madam, it'll come out in time." Can you imagine a silver?
Okay.
I knew that they were, but my mother bought it, and that was how in this little palace we had Shabbat, and finally, it must have been when I got to about time to go to school, because we left and we rented a house in Willesden in London, and from then on I started to go to school. But my life was a bit of a misery at first, because first of all the language, I had a German accent, and secondly, on the continent you had to have a sort of a hairstyle with a sausage on your head.
Yes, if you could just turn it a little bit around.
Yes, this was the hairstyle. I don't know if you can see.
Where were these pictures taken?
These were taken in the back of our house that we rented, the first house.
And how old were you at this time?
No, it can't have been. No, it can't have been. It must have been in Bletchley. I don't know where it was.
Mm-hmm.
Just a minute. Yes, it must have been the back of the house in Bletchley. So there, I'm just saying, because it could have been already in our house, because I must have been 5. I can see I'm wearing a sort of a skirt and jumper. And this was my little baby brother, was born in England.
So was this at the end of the war?
Yes, this was being now about 1945.
Do you remember the war years?
Yes, I do.
With the rationing and
yes,
sure
I remember
food
the rationing and the shrapnel dropping.
Do you remember the Blitz or any bombing?
Yes, the minute we got to London, it was the Blitz.
And you remember the bombs?
Yes, and we had to sleep in an air raid shelter, in a sort of it was called a Morris shelter. It was like this table made of metal with mesh, and we slept in there because there were bombs dropping all the time. And at one point a bomb dropped nearby and our kitchen ceiling fell down. So, luckily we were not in the kitchen at the time. So I do remember that. And I remember running. If you ran to school and the bombs were dropping, you had to quickly go into a doorway to protect yourself. Yes, I do. I remember the war.
And Pessy, can I just go back to when you were living in the attic? Did your parents develop a close friendship with the lady who owned?
Well, now this Mrs. Alderman, She was really wonderful. But she said to my mother, now you can have the laundry line Mondays. Wednesday. I'm doing my washing Mondays. So my mother would do the washing on one of these boards in the sink and made sure that she would do it on alternate days. But I do remember Mrs. Alderman saying, I think you put too much washing on the line, it's beginning to sag. So, and then she had this daughter, Jean, and a son, Brian, and I used to play with them out in the yard, ball, and I remember Jean used to have a little dish with chewing gum, and she was to pop a chewing gum into her mouth. I thought, what a shame I can't reach that dish, So I remember the Aldermans and their garden and so on, but whether there was a good relationship, I don't know. And unfortunately, I never ever thought to try and go back and find these righteous Gentiles, really, in a way, because nobody would give us even an attic except for them.
It's amazing.
It was really a wonderful thing that they did for us. So it's been a long history. I don't know if you'd like to hear any more. You'd like to hear some more?
Absolutely. It's incredible, your history. It really is.
Well, I don't know, really. So I think one of the things that I'd like to explain is that many, many years later, we tried to find a gravestone because my mother's brother, Leo Langerman, he returned to Antwerp. He was known as the chess player of Antwerp. My mother's brother, Leo Langerman, his life was destroyed by the Holocaust. His beautiful wife just didn't. She was in the camps. She didn't survive. And his beautiful daughter, Evelyn, my first cousin, was hidden by nuns. Eventually, he found her. She was about 8 years old when he found her. And she said to him, and I think she may have been about 3 or 4 when she was hidden. So she saw her father, and he said, I'm your father. And she told me herself, Evelyn, and she said, where's my mother? No more. She went hysterical. I want my mother. I want my mother. I don't want you. Don't want you. Go away. And my poor Uncle Leo, her father, was devastated. What's he going to do with this hysterical child? She's a beautiful, beautiful girl. But he had to take her out of the nunnery. The nuns didn't want her to go. Eventually they persuaded this is her father, even though she's screaming and crying, and they let her out. She always had a terrible relationship with her father all her life. And she was beautiful. She actually had a job in Brussels. He lived in Antwerp as a secretary, and she used to visit. My uncle brought her to London. My mother would buy her clothes. By then we were both teenagers, and eventually her father died, and he left all his money to the city of Antwerp. Now, luckily, the city of Antwerp had a law that if you have dependents, you are not allowed to leave them destitute. So they arranged for my cousin to have the heritage which he had, because he also got money, from Germany and so on. Now, the thing was that my poor cousin became paranoid. She imagined all the time bombs coming and killing her, and she was to be running in the streets. So they would phone my father as her uncle, and he would have to come from London to Brussels to rescue her. Eventually she had to be put into a home, and there was a wonderful couple called Rabbi Chaikin in Brussels who took her under their wing. Now, it seems that when she was with the nuns, she was not given a proper diet as a child. And gradually her bones became very, very, they shrunk. And she shrunk into it. I used to visit her all the time from Israel, from wherever I was, I visited her. But she shrunk into a tiny, tiny, tiny little nothing. Her mind was fine. And we could talk and everything, but she was a victim, an absolute victim of the Holocaust. So, in a way, we're fighting for the people who've survived. So my uncle always told me that he had put up a matseva in Putte on the border between Belgium and France, because in Belgium, people who were buried, they would dig them up every 10 years, and but in Putte, they were kept. So on the tombstone here is written, I don't know if you can see this tombstone,
Yeah.
all the names he had inscribed of all the family who perished. And every Friday night, when I light the candles, I have this printed out, and all their names are remembered.
So the memory, please God, will be for eternal blessing.
Yeah.
Can I ask, Pessy, why did your uncle not leave the money for his daughter?
Because she rejected him. And he wrote in his will, because I have a poor relationship with my daughter, I will leave nothing for her. Nothing.
Did she ever get married?
No.
So she really was, in a way, a double victim of the Holocaust.
Yes. And she was beautiful. I don't know if you know the actress Audrey Hepburn, but she was beautiful, absolutely beautiful girl. So that's
Audrey Hepburn came from Brussels, from Belgium as well.
Well, yes, her father was in Antwerp. He fled. I think I mentioned he was the youngest prosecutor in Berlin, the youngest. He was 28 years old, but when he was 33, he had to flee. But between that, he got married to this beautiful, my mother said this was the society wedding of the year. This beautiful woman marrying this wonderful lawyer, a handsome couple. And then came the war.
And could you ever explain to your cousin that it wasn't her father's fault that the mother was murdered in the camps?
No. Because we were teenagers together eventually, growing up together.
Such a tragedy. And did she pass away, or she's still alive?
Well, no, she passed away. She was by this, this Chaikin family. They looked after her, and they looked after her finances. And she passed away because she eventually but they looked for who would be her to receive the money. She left money. She didn't have a will, but the Chaikins had her money. So they said to me, we're going to look and see if there are any cousins around the world, wherever it is, who might be sharing in this money. And they found nobody but me. So what did I and my children and my husband decided to do? My eldest son and his wife Rebecca and their 3 children live in Rehovot. Rehovot has a very nice shul, Berman's shul, and it had like a kind of a largish room which they wanted to make into a library and to have enough activities to attract young people from the shul, because a lot of young people, they have questions and so on and so forth. They wanted them to have activities. So eventually he was the president at the time, Simon Krausz, and Stephen Cronengold, they were joint, he was the treasurer, I think. We used the money to make this beautiful library in Evelyn's name, and outside is a brass plaque with her whole history on it, And people, Simon told me, and I see people reading her history, and that's the Evelyn Langermann Library.
That is such a beautiful story.
Yes, and another part of the thing is that we have a Sefer Torah in her name for my middle son Dov in his shul in Ma'ale Adumim, and her name is on that. And people kiss her all the time, every Shabbat. She is kissed.
This is very, very special.
My cousin Evelyn.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's an interesting story, and I want to just tell you that you know what they say, out of the ashes we rebuild. So my parents made a life for themselves in London. Okay, so I think I have a photo of them somewhere here. I have to look for it. I got it all ready to show you.
And you have something from Buckingham Palace?
Yes, I have. That's what I want to show
See,
you.
it's right over here.
I want to show you.
Yes, yeah, it's right.
Yes, I want to show you that. Now, where's the photo of my parents here? Oh dear.
So beautiful.
I'm sorry to take up so. Oh, here we are. Here we are. In later years, they came to live in Israel.
Your parents?
Yes. So these are my parents in later years. You'll be happy to hear my father passed away at the age of 98 and my mother 94, and they made a very good life for themselves. They worked hard, my father worked hard, and they were married over 60 years. So I decided I have to ask the Queen for a telegram. 60 years in England, in Great Britain, the Queen sends a telegram. So I write, "Dear Queenie, please can you send a telegram to my parents?" She writes back, "Well, send me their birth certificate." I said, "Dear Queen, when we fled onto your hospitable isles, we lost all our papers. I do not have my parents' wedding certificate, but I can assure you they were married. Sorry, no ticky, no washy, no ticky, no, can't be done." So my late husband and I, Neville, went to Dresden. I said, "I'm determined. I'm going to get this telegram for my parents. They deserve it." So off we went to Dresden. When we got to Dresden, we went to stay in the Hilton, because the Hilton has these meals like airport meals, kosher. When we arrive, we see a huge pillar in the hotel, and on it is a big poster which says in German, "Israel is celebrating its 50th anniversary." I said to Neville, "I don't understand. Here we are in Germany, telling us on this poster that Israel is celebrating its 50th anniversary. What is this?" So we asked the young concierge that, "What is this?" So he said, "You know, we are not responsible. I am responsible here for the social activities, but I'm not responsible for what my antecedents did, what the Nazis did. I want to make recompense." And he said, as part of the Hilton chain, I travel around the world to different Hiltons. And when I get to the Hilton in Jerusalem, I am amazed to see what has been done. And he showed us, here outside, we had the huge cathedral bombed. And so many years after the war, it's still in rubble with numbers on it behind a net. We haven't managed to even rebuild this cathedral, and look at what you've done. So we told him why we came. We're only here till Monday, and we want to go Monday morning to the area, the municipality, to see if they've got a copy of my parents' wedding certificate. So he said, "I'm so sorry, but the municipality is closed on a Monday. But I have a colleague. She may open it for you. I will call her. He called his colleague, and she said, right, come up to the 3rd floor, room 303, knock 3 times, and I will open the door. And off we went on Monday morning into the huge hall, and she said, what's the date? Well, I said the date was the 8th of November 1936. So she said, well, I will look. She came back 10 minutes later with an enormous, huge tome, a book. She opened it, and the pages were like paper-thin silk pages. She started leafing. Here it is. Here it is.
It's amazing, Pessy. It wasn't destroyed.
All the records are down in the archives. All the records are there. So she said something about it's going to cost so and so many groschen. Neville and I looked at her. We said, do you know why we do not have the original documents? Do you know the history, how my parents had to flee for their lives? Do you know it's a miracle that I'm here to ask for this? She was completely quiet, and she said, it's all right, you don't have to pay. So we didn't pay. So I sent off the copy. I had it all, a lawyer had to say, this is in German, sent it off to Buckingham Palace. Finally, rather late, better late than never.
Here's a letter from the Queen. And Pessy, if you could just read what
it says.
Elizabeth
Mr. and Mrs. Aaron Markovich, by then they lived in Netanya, 10A Nizza Boulevard, flat 15, Netanya, Israel. I am delighted to send you my warm congratulations on your 62nd wedding anniversary. My best wishes to you for an enjoyable celebration on Sunday, the 15th of November, 1988, Elizabeth R. Anyway, my mother's sitting in the armchair in the Netanya, and I'm proudly carrying this certificate. And my mother, she lost her parents, she lost her sister, she lost her father on the thing. My mother was a Gibora.
A real heroine.
A real heroine. So I said, Mummy, I've got something special for you. What? I said, listen, you've got a telegram from the Queen. Why? I said, I read it to my mother. Elizabeth, that's Queen Elizabeth. So my mother says, listen, in German, she says, listen, the Queen's also just a woman.
It's amazing what you did.
My mother.
That's incredible.
You couldn't impress my mother with the Queen.
Even a letter from the Queen.
So
but I'm sure she must have been extremely grateful. My
mother, look, my mother was very proud of me, but she couldn't really express much joy. My mother, I very, very rarely saw her smile. My mother, she loved all the children and everything, but my mother survived. My mother was a survivor, but she wasn't a joyful person. My father was a survivor, but my father was filled with the joy of survival, the joy of living. It was a different burden that each of them carried and a different attitude to life that they had. So I, in a way, grew up like caring for them, really, and speaking the language English very quickly, and I was like, I suppose, a happyish child, because probably, you accept things as a child. You don't really know many things that you would like to know later on in life. And gradually, you build your life, and they were happy to see that I married Neville. I moved to Sheffield, and we had children, and here you can see now eventually this is just part of the family that we managed to build in Eretz Yisrael.
It's beautiful.
And that's from the time that my parents got married in 1936.
It's amazing.
And looking at this photo, I did once say to my mother, "Mummy, how fantastic. This must have been a marvellous big wedding." She said, "Are you serious? This was 1936, the outbreak of the war. We were in a small hall. We were happy that we eventually decided to get married," which was also a story within itself. And that was how it was. But how did they decide to get married? So I'll just go back to the miracle of marriage. So you see my grandmother.
She looks a very distinguished lady. Very distinguished.
Indomitable, distinguished, wonderful grandmother. I don't know how my mother got that photo. She never explained it to me. So my mother was a very highly cultured woman, educated in Dresden, and she spoke many languages, and she sang with the opera, sang opera and played the piano, and no suitor that came along was good enough for my mother, because he had to speak Hochdeutsch, perfect German.
High German.
High German, no accent, nothing. None of them were good enough. Long comes my father, introduced from Leipzig, a most eligible bachelor, 33, and from Poland. He did not speak Hochdeutsch, but he was very handsome, very good looking. But my mother was very temperamental. No good. But my father was very, very persistent. So my mother eventually thought maybe, but she was so temperamental that eventually, and she was temperamental always, so my father eventually decided, that's it, he's had enough. Off he goes, and my grandmother runs after him. And this is what he told me. She ran after him and she said, "Aaron, listen, I know my daughter is temperamental, but now is 1936. The war is here. We do not know, me and Beryl, what will become of us. If you marry my daughter, at least I know you two together, you have a chance of survival." So he went back in the house and he said to my mother, "Regina, no matter what, I love you, you love me, you're going to marry me." That's how it was. That's how they got married.
Incredible.
And they had the most wonderful partnership, wonderful. There were times which were very, very difficult in the fur trade. People did not buy what he had. He brought in fox furs from America, red fox furs. I remember going with him to his place in the city, seeing hundreds of these red fox furs hanging up, and he's speaking to his brother in America and his brother in Paris. No market. So my mother opened a little agency, for maids, au pairs to be brought. She spoke several languages, from France, from Germany, from Switzerland, from Finland, and she found people in London who were looking, and she started her agency. And she kept the books, and she was very, very efficient. She paid the taxes and everything. And so really it was a wonderful partnership. And I remember my father, he used to say to me as a little child, "Pessy, willst kommen mit mir nach Garlic Hill? You want to come with me to my place in Garlic Hill?" I said, "Yes, Daddy, come." So off I went with him on the tube to what he called Garlic Hill. This was before I could read. I must have been about 4.5 or whatever. And every lunchtime, all he ever had was what he would bring: a dry roll with a little butter, the same for me, and then we would go next door into a little cafeteria. he would have a cup of coffee and I would drink something or other, I can't remember. And I was still starving hungry. That was all he had. Anyhow, I used to love going there and seeing everything and smelling the furs. Anyhow, finally I could read. And I was about 5 and a half. I read very quickly. And I read where we were going, said Garlic Hill. I thought, it's not Garlic Hill, it's Garlic Hill. So I said to him, Daddy, you know, Daddy, it's not Garlic Hill, it's Garlic Hill. He said, that's what I'm selling. I'm telling you, it's Garlic Hill. I'm telling you all the time, that's where we're going, Garlic Hill. So I said, okay, Daddy, we're going to Garlic Hill. Anyhow, as I showed you, little picture, he was very successful eventually and used to travel to Leningrad twice a year to the fur trade, where Hudson's Bay Company had a branch, because it came from Russia, from all over the world, to the fur fair there in Russia. And because he spoke Russian and Polish very nearby, so he became very friendly with the officials who ran the auctions there. So much so that in the hotel where he stayed, and a lot of his pals from the fur trade also stayed, so he would have in the hotel his own cupboard with dishes where he would keep the cognac and the vodka and I don't know what, and jars of herring that he would bring and so on and so on. And he would make kiddish for all of them. But when the officials from Russia came to England, so he would entertain them in his office because he spoke the language, they knew him, and he made them a fantastic Russian smorgasbord. He knew exactly what they liked, herring like this and herring like that. So eventually, when did my father retire? He was travelling backwards and forwards till the age of 90, and they had to close the Hudson's Bay Fur Company because furs went out of fashion in that year. And then he retired and came to Israel and lived in Israel with my mother.
And they were happy to retire to Israel?
Well, yes, he had a flat here all the years. They bought a flat here and they were happy to retire. He was very happy here, and so was my mother, and we would visit them all the time. So that was the miracle of having our own Medina, our own home, their home. And when Neville and I came, we just got up, got in the car, drove over, didn't know where we were going to live, stayed in a hotel, began to find somewhere. We didn't have to knock on any doors.
Pessy, can I just mention, going back to your incredible story,
Yeah.
you know, you said your mother wasn't so, you know, she dealt with post-Holocaust very differently from your father. Maybe she was very traumatized from that incident on the bus when she saw her father running. She must have felt a lot of guilt that she stayed on the bus and he was taken off.
Terrible.
You know, it's hard to even imagine what she went through.
Terrible. And when she told me the story, my tefillin, I mean, and she told me that story.
And it was the last time she ever saw him.
Last time she ever saw her parents.
There must be, that pain can never go away.
Exactly. That's why I'm surprised they were normal at all. You know, that's why I'm not surprised they never could. My mother couldn't smile, really. And her sister, a beautiful sister, you know. And I mean, I think she was, in a way, because she sort of like worked her way through life, you know. She sort of like, she had friends of a similar background, and it was a very strange thing. My mother and her friends, they didn't call one another by their first names ever. My mother would say, oh, I would say, Mummy, you know, Mrs. Fallick's on the phone. Right. So my mother would, I remember, she would smooth her hair, she would smooth her dress, she would take off her apron as though Mrs. Fallick could see her on the phone. She would prepare herself, and they would have a long conversation, all in German. Wie geht es, Frau Fallick? Ja, Frau Markovic. They never called one another by their first name. Yes, Frau Wohl, file this, file that, for the, And so my mother eventually, she wasn't able to look after herself. And here in Jerusalem, there was like a caring place, not an old age, it was like an old age home, but it was also for people who were incapacitated. And they suddenly started calling her Regina. I thought, what a chutzpah, these young kids calling her Regina. I never heard anybody call her Regina in my life, never. And she took it on the chin. Didn't worry her. She never complained, never.
So Pessy, I'd just like to ask you, what message, you've gone through an incredible journey, your life and your experiences. What message would you give the next generation and for people who are watching this video?
Well, what do you get from this, Les? Let me ask you.
I'll tell you, to think that there were miracles, there were real miracles that happened, and how your family overcame, and they built up a life. And they, instead of being depressed and instead of just blaming, they decided to pick themselves up under very difficult circumstances.
Yeah.
And that your father started another, when he went to Belgium, started after losing everything in Germany, and to start again. It takes tremendous courage.
Yes. So perhaps the message is never take no for an answer.
And your mother, when they said you can't, when they were evacuating 80 years ago, and she said no. And look at the amazing, to take a revolver that is one of the most amazing stories I've ever heard.
My mother, what do you mean?
Where she took the revolver from.
Oh yes, yes.
And she threatened to.
I'm so happy that the catch must have been on, because otherwise I wouldn't be here to tell the story. So Les, I want to thank you so much for this opportunity.
If I can just come in with you.
Yes.
So
we're speaking during Corona time. Nobody believes it.
I just really want to thank you so much. It's been, there are no words to describe. Really, it's been just the most amazing experience hearing your life journey and the miracles, and it's so inspiring. And I cannot tell you how I appreciate your valuable time and you sharing it with us.
Your valuable time.
No, but it's been a real honor and a privilege, and you can be so proud what your parents did and their courage. This is something we can all really strive to emulate. Their memories, please God, will be for eternal blessing, but what your family have done, how you made libraries, and you've done so much chesed, and how you've helped so many people here in Israel, and it's so inspirational.
Thank you.
And I really want to thank you from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Les.
It's really been extremely
Dr. Les Glassman is a most unusual historian.
No, but thank you, Pessy. I really, really appreciate it.
And that's what I'd like to say. Thank you, Les.
It's the greatest pleasure.